In this video, we're going to be looking at two cameras that are very similar to each other, but are they actually clones? Let's jump into this video and talk about it. In 1979, the Contax 139 Quartz was released to the market. This is a much smaller camera and probably goes along with the downsizing that had occurred in the industry probably 4 or 5 years before. This was a much smaller camera compared with the earlier Contax RTS cameras, and RTX stood for real-time system. This is an RTS2, not the original model, but it still is fairly close in size, probably to the original model, and you can see how much taller the RTS camera is and how it's really just a much larger camera than the 139 Quartz. Like nearly all of the Contax cameras, this camera was dead in the water without batteries. There was not a single manual shutter speed, so if your batteries died, your day of photography was now over. I think for that reason, most people probably kept at least a spare set, or most people should have kept a spare set of batteries in their bag. The Contax 139 was a full-featured camera intended for the amateur market, and we'll jump into that in a bit. First off, all of the Contax cameras were produced in Japan by Yashica, and then later Kyocera. From what I've read, the reason for this is that when Zeiss Icon folded, it no longer had any connection to the 35mm market, aside from the Rolleiflex cameras, but they certainly had never captured a large portion of the photography market. So enter Yashica, which became a contract manufacturer for both the lenses and the camera bodies. The reintroduction of the Contax name in association with a line of high-quality Zeiss lenses allowed the company to once again compete for the high-end buyer in the photography market. So remember, coming less than a decade after the demise of Zeiss Icon, there were still many buyers who had fond memories of the Contax line of rangefinder cameras, which had been in production from 1932 to 1962. For sure, this was an exciting time for Carl Zeiss AG as it moved forward with a new era of camera bodies and high-quality lenses. This was a very important project for Zeiss, and it certainly deserves more than what I'm providing here. 1 year later, in 1980, Yashica released the FXD Quartz. Like the Contax, it was a fully battery-dependent camera with no manual shutter speeds offered should the battery die. Let's look at these two cameras side by side and compare them. The one thing that I couldn't find was the original price for both of these cameras, but rest assured the Contax with the Zeiss lens would have been much more expensive than the Yashica with the Yashica lens. With the introduction of the Contax cameras, there was a new lens mount known as the Yashica/Contax mount, or Y/C. So when you look at the cameras, they appear to be roughly the same height, and in fact I would say that they are the same height. They're roughly the same thickness. There are some differences between each of the cameras, particularly when it comes to the top deck layout. So let's take a quick look at that. Now you can see some of the differences between the bodies. The shape is a bit different, whereas this is a boxy type shape. This has this really sort of curved back, probably makes it a bit more comfortable to hold. The Contax has a hot shoe with 2 contact points, which meant a dedicated flash. And the Yashica had a hot shoe with a single contact point, but also a dedicated flash. My guess is that 2 flashes probably could not be, well, they probably could be shared with each other, but would not operate in the same manner. This probably would have more advanced features that this might not have, and that would make sense. You have your film advance cranks right here, your film advance lever. These were single stroke, which meant that you could not advance the film in small increments. It was a single stroke. The shutter release is right here on the same camera, but there were some differences in the layout. Your frame counter is here on the Yashica on the side, and it's up front on the Contax. On this side, you had your film speed settings with exposure compensation. On the Contax, these were your shutter speeds. Film compensation was around here. Here it's marked in stops, and here it's marked in factor. Your film speed setting was here on the Contax. And your film speed setting, as I mentioned, was over here on the Yashica. To change the film speed settings on the Contax, you had to lift and turn till you found your correct speed or your desired speed, then drop it into place. Here, there was a small button on the back, and you would press that, and then you would spin the dial. Very simple. Both of these offered full auto exposure or flash synchronization or a full range of manual shutter speeds, with this one running from 1,000th of a second down to 1 second plus B. This also had that same range, flash synchronization, auto exposure, 1,000th of a second, all the way down to B. From what I've read, the longest shutter speed for this, for the Contax on auto, was 11 seconds. Here I timed it. It felt like it was about 4 seconds. It might have gone longer, but I couldn't really tell. It's simply indicated in your viewfinder is LT, which I assume would be long time. Moving to the back of the cameras, still some similarities. You had your little film minder panel. Here you had port. This was a cable port. So if you remove this small plug, you could then thread in a small cable release and release your shutter in that manner. As you can see, that plug is difficult to remove, and it's not unusual to find it missing on cameras. And here you had a button that was on the back of the camera. The button, in both cases, locked this dial, whatever its function. In this case, when you were on either flash synchronization or auto, the dial wouldn't turn. So you had to push in this button, turn the dial, and now the dial spins freely among all of the manually selected shutter speeds. On the Yashica, if you wanted to change the film speed or make adjustments to exposure compensation, you would press that button and then turn the dial. To open the back of either camera, lift up on the rewind knob and pull up, and the back will pop open. Film runs traditionally in both cameras from left to right, and both cameras use a vertical metal blade shutter that is electronically controlled. The film rails are slightly different. Here you can see this little piece right here, how it differs in shape. Approximate location, of course, is going to be identical with both sets of frame rails. And of course, you have a pressure plate, and the role of the pressure plate is to keep film flat as possible against these film rails. So when you take your photo, you will get as sharp a photo as possible, always dependent upon the lens being able to record a sharp image. On the bottom of the two cameras, you see a lot of similarities. First of all, the placement of the battery chamber. This camera used two S76 or LR44, or I believe the ever-ready designation is 365, two button cells, 1.5 volts each. And because it is such a battery-dependent camera, you should always have a spare set on hand. The placement of the tripod socket is identical, and it is in alignment with the center of the lens. Here are the contact points for the winder, film winder, and here's the coupling for the film winder. You'll notice that here is a small little indentation or a small little socket, and that would be for a locating pin on the Contax winder. The Yashica winder has no such locating pin. I believe it would work best if the Yashica winder was used on the Contax camera. I'm not so sure that the Contax winder is going to mate with the Yashica camera simply because of that locating pin. I can't find my Contax winder at the moment, so I don't know if the locating pin is spring pressured or if it's fixed in place. Obviously, with both cameras sharing the same lens mount, it's fairly simple to mount either lens to the other camera. That is, you can mount any Yashica lens, any of the Yashica lenses to any of the Contax cameras, and most likely any of the Contax or the Carl Zeiss lenses to any of the Yashica bodies. Fairly simple to do. They're both going to operate the same. You're going to get full features with both cameras. There is no difference other than the image that you record on film. The viewfinder displays are nearly identical. You have a split image in the middle with that ground glass collar and or microprism and then a Fresnel screen or a ground glass screen. On the right side is a small scale that indicates all of your available shutter speeds, and both of them have LT, which I guess would mean longer time exposure, near the bottom. On auto exposure, an LED will flash to indicate what shutter speed the camera believes you should be using. On manual exposure, you're going to get two LEDs. One is going to be the suggested shutter speed, while the other is going to be your actual shutter speed. That is, the shutter speed that you have dialed in using the shutter speed ring. All of the Yashica and Contax cameras, unfortunately, also share one more characteristic, and that is degraded body coverings. I don't know that there is any Contax or Yashica camera on the market today from that era that does not require a new covering. For some reason, I don't know what happens, but all of the coverings just seem to flake off, leaving you with just the original fabric that's underneath. However, you can buy replacement coverings. I've been buying them from this one site in Japan, and I'll leave a link in the comments below. I don't have any connection to the site other than purchasing new body coverings. So one more thing I wanted to mention was the function of this. You're going to notice that there's a small LED on both cameras and this small lever here. On this camera, it is used to set the self-timer. Once you've tensioned the shutter, you pull upward and it will remain in position. When you press the shutter release, the LED that I mentioned earlier will begin blinking intermittently, slowly at first and then more rapidly as it reaches the end of its 10-second cycle. On the Yashica, this is more of a multifunction lever. So when the switch is on 0, it just has no function, of course. Here, it acts as an auto exposure lock. That means it will hold the exposure that you've set. And then here's your self-timer, ST. With both cameras, pressing this small button here in the middle of it turns on the meter for about 10 seconds. There is no meter on-off switch. If you happen to have something resting on top of your camera or pressing against that front button, it will keep your meter turned on and eventually drain the batteries. Once that battery is drained, your photographic fun will come to an abrupt end unless you have a backup set of batteries, which I mentioned earlier that you should always keep up when it comes to this camera. That's true of all the Contax cameras. They all were battery dependent and offered no ability to provide a single shutter speed should the batteries die. So with all of these cameras, either Contax or Yashica, I've replaced the degraded original body covering with new material. This is not actually snakeskin, it's just embossed as snakeskin. These are all black. I really wanted to keep close to the original color. This is a coarser grain pebble finish. I sort of like it. I think it's easy to grip, looks good too. On this Contax 137 MA Quartz, the covering has a tighter grain. And with this camera, the RTS, I went with a different type of finish. All of these are a black finish. This one's a bit softer. I sort of like this one, but I like the feel of it. About 10 years ago, I bought my first Yashica FXD, and of course I had to replace the body covering on it. And this one I had a bit of fun with. This one I put this yellow embossed, lizard embossed, or snakeskin embossed covering. At the time I was living in Pittsburgh, so I used to call this the Steelers camera. That would be related to the football team. And at various times I've thought about selling it, but for whatever reason I never have. So it just sits up on my shelf and I've used it a couple times and it's an adequate camera. I don't know that I'll sell it. I'll probably hang on to it and, perhaps pass it along to somebody else someday. I purchased another FXD and I've already stripped off the body covering, as you can see. So I'm waiting for the new covering to arrive. With all these other coverings, I'm just using your basic black. I really like the black covering. I think it stays a bit closer to the original. Uh, Whatever you do with your camera is fine. I sort of like to keep close to the original. But like I said, if you want to have fun, I know the coverings are available in blue and brown and green and pink and obviously yellow. So, your camera, your choice. So this is the Yashica film winder, and you can see how this covering has really degraded. In fact, I think I can probably flake off some of the material. Yes. The kit that I bought for that FXD also includes new coverings for the winder. So let's do a weigh-in and get an idea of what these cameras weigh. So first we have the Yashica FXD. And this camera weighs just over a pound. 1 pound, 0.6 ounces. If you want to round that up, you could say 1 pound, 1 ounce. And how about the Contax 139? This camera feels fairly lightweight, not heavy at all. And this camera comes in at 1 pound, 1.7 ounces. You could say 1 pound, 2 ounces. So what? This was 1 pound, 0.6. This is 1 pound, 1.7. So you could even say this is just 1 ounce heavier. How about the Contax RTS, of course? So remember, both of these were just slightly more than a pound. This is 1 pound, 9 ounces, 9.5 ounces. If you wanted to round up, you could say 1 pound, 10 ounces. So this is obviously a much heavier camera. And how about this Contax 137 MA Quartz? This is 1 pound, 5.3 ounces. So it's sort of in between the Contax 139 and the Contax RTS2. This camera is a bit different in that it has no film advance. It's fully motor driven. This uses 4 AA batteries, which power both the camera and the meter. So that's nice. So as we look at these two cameras, why would you pick one over the other? Obviously, if you're on a tighter budget, you're going to go with the Yashica. And if you really are interested in the Zeiss lenses and shooting with those, you're going to select the Contax. This would have been your budget option. This would have been your premium option. But that's sort of photography, right? I mean, why do people select Leica over Nikon or Canon? Because they believe having that German premium lens will give them better photographs. Both of these cameras are certainly going to get the job done. Each of these lenses is going to be a bit different in how they render images. The planar lens design, I believe Zeiss says it's been the most plagiarized lens design in history. That is, most 50 millimeter lenses today are in fact planar designs or modified planar designs. If you want the original, you go with this one. If you're okay with a version of it, go with the cheaper one. Like I said, it all depends upon your budget. If you're shopping for these today, expect to replace the foam seals and the body covering, unless somebody else has replaced it. I think if you look on eBay, you will find that nearly any Contax or Yashica camera from that era is going to have a worn out body covering. It only takes maybe 25-30 minutes to replace it. It's not that big of a deal. One key when you do put it on is to spray the back of it with rubbing alcohol. That will give you time to position the body covering before the adhesive really takes hold. As the alcohol evaporates, then you're just left with your adhesive against the body, and it works pretty well. Particularly when you have to try to get the covering pushed under here. But it's a job you only have to do once, and it looks pretty good once you have these body coverings in place. While some may say that these are very different cameras, I still tend to believe that they share a lot in common. Some of the dials and buttons might have slightly different functions, but really they're nearly the same camera. So thanks for joining me on this walkthrough of the Contax 139 Quartz and the Yashica FXD Quartz. Two cameras separated on the market by just 1 year and with a lot of similarities and some differences. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this video, think about giving me a like. And if you'd like to make a comment, there's plenty of space below, or you can send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. And click my logo down here in the lower right corner of the screen for more content about cameras and photography. And I'll see you on the next video.